Part 3 of Philebus by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Socrates. There still remains one other sort of admixture of pleasures and pains. Protarchus. What is that? Socrates. The union which, as we were saying, the mind often experiences of purely mental feelings. Protarchus. What do you mean? Socrates. Why, do we not speak of anger, fear, desire, sorrow, love, emulation, envy, and the like, as pains which belong to the soul only? Protarchus. Yes. Socrates. And shall we not find them also full of the most wonderful pleasures? Need I remind you of the anger which stirs even a wise man to violence, and is sweeter than honey and the honeycomb? And you remember how pleasures mingle with pains in lamentation and bereavement? Protarchus. Yes, there is a natural connection between them. Socrates. And you remember also how at the sight of tragedies the spectators smile through their tears? Protarchus. Certainly I do. Socrates. And are you aware that even at a comedy the soul experiences a mixed feeling of pain and pleasure? Protarchus. I do not quite understand you. Socrates. I admit, Protarchus, that there is some difficulty in recognizing this mixture of feelings at a comedy. Protarchus. There is, I think. Socrates. And the greater the obscurity of the case, the more desirable is the examination of it, because the difficulty in detecting other cases of mixed pleasures and pains will be less. Protarchus. Proceed. Socrates. I have just mentioned envy. Would you not call that a pain of the soul? Protarchus. Yes. Socrates. And yet the envious man finds something in the misfortunes of his neighbors at which he is pleased? Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And ignorance, and what is termed clownishness, are surely an evil? Protarchus. To be sure. Socrates. From these considerations, learn to know the nature of the ridiculous. Protarchus. Explain. Socrates. The ridiculous is, in short, the specific name which is used to describe the vicious form of a certain habit, and of vice in general it is that kind which is most at variance with the inscription at Delphi. Protarchus. You mean, Socrates, know thyself? Socrates. I do. And the opposite would be, know not thyself. Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And now, O Protarchus, try to divide this into three. Protarchus. Indeed, I am afraid that I cannot. Socrates. Do you mean to say that I must make the division for you? Protarchus. Yes. And what is more, I beg that you will. Socrates. Are there not three ways in which ignorance of self may be shown? Protarchus. What are they? Socrates. In the first place, about money. The ignorant may fancy himself richer than he is. Protarchus. Yes, that is a very common error. Socrates. And still more often he will fancy that he is taller or fairer than he is, or that he has some other advantage of person which he really has not. Protarchus. Of course. Socrates. And yet surely by far the greatest number err about the goods of the mind. They imagine themselves to be much better men than they are. Protarchus. Yes, that is by far the commonest delusion. Socrates. And of all the virtues, is not wisdom the one which the mass of mankind are always claiming, and which most arouses in them a spirit of contention and lying conceit of wisdom? Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And may not all this be truly called an evil condition? Protarchus. Very evil. Socrates. But we must pursue the division a step further, Protarchus, if we would see in envy of the childish sort a singular mixture of pleasure and pain. Protarchus. How can we make the further division which you suggest? Socrates. All who are silly enough to entertain this lying conceit of themselves may of course be divided, like the rest of mankind, into two classes, one having power and might, and the other the reverse. Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. Let this, then, be the principle of division. Those of them who are weak and unable to revenge themselves, when they are laughed at, may be truly called ridiculous, but those who can defend themselves may be more truly described as strong and formidable. For ignorance in the powerful is hateful and horrible, because hurtful to others, both in reality and in fiction. But powerless ignorance may be reckoned, and in truth is ridiculous. Protarchus. That is very true, but I do not as yet see where is the admixture of pleasures and pains. Socrates. Well then, let us examine the nature of envy. Protarchus. Proceed. Socrates. Is not envy an unrighteous pleasure, and also an unrighteous pain? Protarchus. Most true. Socrates. There is nothing envious or wrong in rejoicing at the misfortunes of enemies? Protarchus. Certainly not. Socrates. But to feel joy instead of sorrow at the sight of our friends' misfortunes, is not that wrong? Protarchus. Undoubtedly. Socrates. Did we not say that ignorance was always an evil? Protarchus. True. Socrates. And the three kinds of vain conceit in our friends which we enumerated, the vain conceit of beauty, of wisdom, and of wealth, are ridiculous if they are weak, and detestable when they are powerful. May we not say, as I was saying before, that our friends who are in this state of mind, when harmless to others, are simply ridiculous? Protarchus. They are ridiculous. Socrates. And do we not acknowledge this ignorance of theirs to be a misfortune? Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And do we feel pain or pleasure in laughing at it? Protarchus. Clearly we feel pleasure. Socrates. And was not envy the source of this pleasure, which we feel at the misfortunes of friends? Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. Then the argument shows that when we laugh at the folly of our friends, pleasure, in mingling with envy, mingles with pain. For envy has been acknowledged by us to be mental pain, and laughter is pleasant, and so we envy and laugh at the same instant. Protarchus. True. Socrates. And the argument implies that there are combinations of pleasure and pain in lamentations, and in tragedy and comedy, not only on the stage, but on the greater stage of human life, and so in endless other cases. Protarchus. I do not see how any one can deny what you say, Socrates, however eager he may be to assert the opposite opinion. Socrates. I mentioned anger, desire, sorrow, fear, love, emulation, envy, and similar emotions as examples in which we should find a mixture of the two elements so often named. Did I not? Protarchus. Yes. Socrates. We may observe that our conclusions hitherto have had reference only to sorrow and envy and anger? Protarchus. I see. Socrates. Then many other cases still remain? Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And why do you suppose me to have pointed out to you the admixture which takes place in comedy? Why, but to convince you that there was no difficulty in showing the mixed nature of fear and love and similar affections. And I thought that when I had given you the illustration, you would have let me off, and have acknowledged as a general truth that the body without the soul, and the soul without the body, as well as the two united, are susceptible of all sorts of admixtures of pleasures and pains, and so further discussion would have been unnecessary. And now I want to know whether I may depart, or will you keep me here until midnight? I fancy that I may obtain my release without many words, if I promise that tomorrow I will give you an account of all these cases. But at present I would rather sail in another direction, and go to other matters which remain to be settled, before the judgment can be given which Philebus demands. Protarchus. Very good, Socrates. In what remains, take your own course. Socrates. Then, after the mixed pleasures, the unmixed should have their turn. This is the natural and necessary order. Protarchus. Excellent. Socrates. These, in turn, then, I will now endeavor to indicate. For with the maintainers of the opinion that all pleasures are a cessation of pain, I do not agree. But, as I was saying, I use them as witnesses. that there are pleasures which seem only and are not, and there are others again which have great power and appear in many forms, yet are intermingled with pains, and are partly alleviations of agony and distress, both of body and mind. Pro. Then what pleasures, Socrates, should we be right in conceiving to be true? Soc. True pleasures are those which are given by beauty of color and form, and most of those which arise from smells. Those of sound again, and in general those of which the want is painless and unconscious, and of which the fruition is palpable to sense and pleasant and unalloyed with pain. Pro. Once more, Socrates, I must ask what you mean. Soc. My meaning is certainly not obvious, and I will endeavor to be plainer. I do not mean by beauty of form such beauty as that of animals or pictures, which the many would suppose to be my meaning. But, says the argument, understand me to mean straight lines and circles, and the plain or solid figures which are formed out of them by turning lathes and rulers and measurers of angles. For these I affirm to be not only relatively beautiful, like other things, but they are eternally and absolutely beautiful, and they have peculiar pleasures, quite unlike the pleasures of scratching. And there are colors which are of the same character, and have similar pleasures. Now do you understand my meaning? Pro. I am trying to understand, Socrates, and I hope that you will try to make your meaning clearer. Soc. When sounds are smooth and clear, and have a single pure tone, then I mean to say that they are not relatively, but absolutely beautiful, and have natural pleasures associated with them. Pro. Yes, there are such pleasures. Soc. The pleasures of smell are of a less ethereal sort, but they have no necessary admixture of pain, and all pleasures, however and wherever experienced, which are unattended by pains, I assign to an analogous class. Here then are two kinds of pleasures. Pro. I understand. Soc. To these may be added the pleasures of knowledge, if no hunger of knowledge and no pain caused by such hunger precede them. Pro. And this is the case. Soc. Well, but if a man who is full of knowledge loses his knowledge, are there not pains of forgetting? Pro. Not necessarily, but there may be times of reflection when he feels grief at the loss of his knowledge. Soc. Yes, my friend, but at present we are enumerating only the natural perceptions, and have nothing to do with reflection. Pro. In that case you are right in saying that the loss of knowledge is not attended with pain. Soc. These pleasures of knowledge then are unmixed with pain, and they are not the pleasures of the many, but of a very few. Pro. Quite true. Soc. And now, having fairly separated the pure pleasures and those which may be rightly termed impure, let us further add to our description of them that the pleasures which are in excess have no measure, but that those which are not in excess have measure. The great, the excessive, whether more or less frequent, we shall be right in referring to the class of the infinite, and of the more and less, which pours through body and soul alike, and the others we shall refer to the class which has measure. Pro. Quite right, Socrates. Soc. Still, there is something more to be considered about pleasures. Pro. What is it? Soc. When you speak of purity and clearness, or of excess, abundance, greatness, and sufficiency, in what relation do these terms stand to truth? Pro. Why do you ask, Socrates? Soc. Because, Protarchus, I should wish to test pleasure and knowledge in every possible way, in order that if there be a pure and impure element in either of them, I may present the pure element for judgment, and then they will be more easily judged of by you, and by me, and by all of us. Pro. Most true. Soc. Let us investigate all the pure kinds, first selecting for consideration a single instance. Pro. What instance shall we select? Soc. Suppose that we first of all take whiteness. Pro. Very good. Soc. How can there be purity in whiteness, and what purity? Is that purest which is greatest or most in quantity, or that which is most unadulterated and freest from any admixture of other colors? Pro. Clearly that which is most unadulterated. Socrates. True, Protarchus, and so the purest white, and not the greatest or largest in quantity, is to be deemed truest and most beautiful? Protarchus. Right. Socrates. And we shall be quite right in saying that a little pure white is whiter and fairer and truer than a great deal that is mixed? Protarchus. Perfectly right. Socrates. There is no need of adducing many similar examples in illustration of the argument about pleasure. One such is sufficient to prove to us that a small pleasure, or a small amount of pleasure, if pure, or unalloyed with pain, is always pleasanter and truer and fairer than a great pleasure, or a great amount of pleasure of another kind. Protarchus. Assuredly, and the instance you have given is quite sufficient. Socrates. But what do you say of another question? Have we not heard that pleasure is always a generation, and has no true being? Do not certain ingenious philosophers teach this doctrine, and ought not we to be grateful to them? Protarchus. What do they mean? Socrates. I will explain to you, my dear Protarchus, what they mean by putting a question. Protarchus. Ask, and I will answer. Socrates. I assume that there are two natures, one self-existent, and the other ever in want of something. Protarchus. What manner of natures are they? Socrates. The one majestic ever, the other inferior. Protarchus. You speak riddles. Socrates. You have seen loves good and fair, and also brave lovers of them. Protarchus. I should think so. Socrates. Search the universe for two terms which are like these two, and are present everywhere. Protarchus. Yet a third time I must say, be a little plainer, Socrates. Socrates. There is no difficulty, Protarchus. The argument is only in play, and insinuates that some things are for the sake of something else, relatives, and that other things are the ends to which the former class subserves, absolutes. Protarchus. Your many repetitions make me slow to understand. Socrates. As the argument proceeds, my boy, I dare say that the meaning will become clearer. Protarchus. Very likely. Socrates. Here are two new principles. Protarchus. What are they? Socrates. One is the generation of all things, and the other is essence. Protarchus. I readily accept from you both generation and essence. Socrates. Very right. And would you say that generation is for the sake of essence, or essence for the sake of generation? Protarchus. You want to know whether that which is called essence is, properly speaking, for the sake of generation? Socrates. Yes. Protarchus. By the gods, I wish that you would repeat your question. Socrates. I mean, O my Protarchus, to ask whether you would tell me that shipbuilding is for the sake of ships, or ships for the sake of shipbuilding, and in all similar cases I should ask the same question. Protarchus. Why do you not answer yourself, Socrates? Socrates. I have no objection, but you must take your part. Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. My answer is that all things instrumental, remedial, material, are given to us with a view to generation, and that each generation is relative to, or for the sake of, some being or essence, and that the whole of generation is relative to the whole of essence. Protarchus. Assuredly. Socrates. Then pleasure, being a generation, must surely be for the sake of some essence? Protarchus. True. Socrates. And that for the sake of which something else is done must be placed in the class of good, and that which is done for the sake of something else in some other class, my good friend. Protarchus. Most certainly. Socrates. Then pleasure, being a generation, will be rightly placed in some other class than that of good? Protarchus. Quite right. Socrates. Then, as I said at first, we ought to be very grateful to him who first pointed out that pleasure was a generation only, and had no true being at all, for he is clearly one who laughs at the notion of pleasure being a good. Protarchus. Assuredly. Socrates. And he would surely laugh also at those who make generation their highest end. Protarchus. Of whom are you speaking, and what do they mean? Socrates. I am speaking of those who, when they are cured of hunger or thirst, or any other defect, by some process of generation, are delighted at the process as if it were pleasure. And they say that they would not wish to live without these and other feelings of a like kind which might be mentioned. Pro. That is certainly what they appear to think. Soc. And is not destruction universally admitted to be the opposite of generation? Pro. Certainly. Soc. Then he who chooses thus would choose generation and destruction rather than that third sort of life, in which, as we were saying, was neither pleasure nor pain, but only the purest possible thought. Pro. He who would make us believe pleasure to be a good is involved in great absurdities, Socrates. Soc. Great indeed, and there is yet another of them. Pro. What is it? Soc. Is there not an absurdity in arguing that there is nothing good or noble in the body, or in anything else, but that good is in the soul only, and that the only good of the soul is pleasure, and that courage, or temperance, or understanding, or any other good of the soul is not really a good? And is there not yet a further absurdity in our being compelled to say that he who has a feeling of pain and not of pleasure is bad at the time when he is suffering pain, even though he be the best of men, and again that he who has a feeling of pleasure, in so far as he is pleased at the time when he is pleased, in that degree excels in virtue? Pro. Nothing, Socrates, can be more irrational than all this. Soc. And now, having subjected pleasure to every sort of test, let us not appear to be too sparing of mind and knowledge. Let us ring their metal bravely, and see if there be unsoundness in any part, until we have found out what in them is of the purest nature, and then the truest elements, both of pleasure and knowledge, may be brought up for judgment. Pro. Right. Soc. Knowledge has two parts, the one productive and the other educational? Pro. True. Soc. And in the productive or handicraft arts is not one part more akin to knowledge, and the other less? And may not the one part be regarded as the pure, and the other as the impure? Pro. Certainly. Soc. Let us separate the superior or dominant elements in each of them. Pro. What are they, and how do you separate them? Soc. I mean to say that if arithmetic, mensuration, and weighing be taken away from any art, that which remains will not be much. Pro. Not much, certainly. Soc. The rest will be only conjecture, and the better use of the senses which is given by experience and practice, in addition to a certain power of guessing, which is commonly called art, and is perfected by attention and pains. Pro. Nothing more, assuredly. Soc. Music, for instance, is full of this empiricism, for sounds are harmonized not by measure, but by skilful conjecture. The music of the flute is always trying to guess the pitch of each vibrating note, and is therefore mixed up with much that is doubtful, and has little which is certain. Pro. Most true. Soc. And the same will be found to hold good of medicine and husbandry and piloting and generalship. Pro. Very true. Soc. The art of the builder, on the other hand, which uses a number of measures and instruments, attains by their help to a greater degree of accuracy than the other arts. Pro. How is that? Soc. In shipbuilding and house building, and in other branches of the art of carpentering, the builder has his rule, lathe, compass, line, and a most ingenious machine for straightening wood. Pro. Very true, Socrates. Soc. Then now let us divide the arts of which we were speaking into two kinds, the arts which, like music, are less exact in their results, and those which, like carpentering, are more exact. Pro. Let us make that division. Soc. Of the latter class, the most exact of all are those which we just now spoke of as primary. Pro. I see that you mean arithmetic and the kindred arts of weighing and measuring. Soc. Certainly, Protarchus. But are not these also distinguishable into two kinds? Pro. What are the two kinds? Soc. In the first place, arithmetic is of two kinds, one of which is popular, and the other philosophical. Pro. How would you distinguish them? Soc. There is a wide difference between them, Protarchus. Some arithmeticians reckon unequal units, as for example, 2 armies, 2 oxen, 2 very large things, or 2 very small things. the party who are opposed to them insist that every unit in 10,000 must be the same as every other unit. Protarchus, undoubtedly there is, as you say, a great difference among the votaries of the science, and there may be reasonably supposed to be two sorts of arithmetic. Socrates, and when we compare the art of mensuration which is used in building with philosophical geometry, or the art of computation which is used in trading with exact calculation, shall we say of either of the pairs that it is one or two? Protarchus, on the analogy of what has preceded, I should be of opinion that they were severally two. Socrates, right. But do you understand why I have discussed the subject? Protarchus, I think so, but I should like to be told by you. Socrates, the argument has all along been seeking a parallel to pleasure, and, true to that original design, has gone on to ask whether one sort of knowledge is purer than another, as one pleasure is purer than another. Protarchus, clearly, that was the intention. Socrates, and has not the argument in what has preceded already shown that the arts have different provinces and vary in their degrees of certainty? Protarchus, very true. Socrates, and just now did not the argument first designate a particular art by a common term, thus making us believe in the unity of that art, and then again, as if speaking of two different things, proceed to inquire whether the art, as pursued by philosophers, or as pursued by non-philosophers, has more of certainty and purity? Protarchus, that is the very question which the argument is asking. Socrates, and how, Protarchus, shall we answer the inquiry? Protarchus, O Socrates, we have reached a point at which the difference of clearness in different kinds of knowledge is enormous. Socrates, then the answer will be the easier. Protarchus, certainly. And let us say in reply that those arts into which arithmetic and mensuration enter far surpass all others, and that of these the arts or sciences which are animated by the pure philosophic impulse are infinitely superior in accuracy and truth. Socrates, then this is your judgment, and this is the answer which, upon your authority, we will give to all masters of the art of misinterpretation? Protarchus, what answer? Socrates, that there are two arts of arithmetic, and two of mensuration, and also several other arts, which in like manner have this double nature, and yet only one name. Protarchus, let us boldly return this answer to the masters of whom you speak, Socrates, and hope for good luck. Socrates, we have explained what we term the most exact arts or sciences? Protarchus, very good. Socrates, and yet, Protarchus, dialectic will refuse to acknowledge us if we do not award to her the first place. Protarchus, and pray, what is dialectic? Socrates, clearly the science which has to do with all that knowledge of which we are now speaking. For I am sure that all men who have a grain of intelligence will admit that the knowledge which has to do with being and reality, and sameness and unchangeableness, is by far the truest of all. But how would you decide this question, Protarchus? Protarchus, I have often heard Gorgias maintain, Socrates, that the art of persuasion far surpassed every other. This, as he says, is by far the best of them all, for to it all things submit, not by compulsion, but of their own free will. Now, I should not like to quarrel either with you or with him. Socrates, you mean to say that you would like to desert if you were not ashamed? Protarchus, as you please. Socrates, may I not have led you into a misapprehension? Protarchus, how? Socrates, dear Protarchus, I never asked which was the greatest, or best, or usefulest of arts or sciences, but which had clearness and accuracy and the greatest amount of truth, however humble and little useful an art. And as for Gorgias, if you do not deny that his art has the advantage in usefulness to mankind, he will not quarrel with you for saying that the study of which I am speaking is superior in this particular or essential truth, as in the comparison of white colors, a little whiteness, if that little be only pure, was said to be superior in truth to a great mass which is impure. And now let us give our best attention, and consider well, not the comparative use or reputation of the sciences, but the power or faculty, if there be such, which the soul has of loving the truth, and of doing all things for the sake of it. Let us search into the pure element of mind and intelligence, and then we shall be able to say whether the science of which I have been speaking is most likely to possess the faculty, or whether there be some other which has higher claims. Pro. Well, I have been considering, and I can hardly think that any other science or art has a firmer grasp of the truth than this. Soc. Do you say so because you observe that the arts in general, and those engaged in them, make use of opinion, and are resolutely engaged in the investigation of matters of opinion? Even he who supposes himself to be occupied with nature is really occupied with the things of this world, how created, how acting or acted upon. Is not this the sort of inquiry in which his life is spent? Pro. True. Soc. He is laboring, not after eternal being, but about things which are becoming, or which will or have become. Pro. Very true. Soc. And can we say that any of these things which neither are, nor have been, nor will be unchangeable, when judged by the strict rule of truth, ever become certain? Pro. Impossible. Soc. How can anything fixed be concerned with that which has no fixedness? Pro. How indeed? Soc. Then mind and science, when employed about such changing things, do not attain the highest truth? Pro. I should imagine not. Soc. And now let us bid farewell, a long farewell, to you or me, or Philebus, or Gorgias, and urge on behalf of the argument a single point. Pro. What point? Soc. Let us say that the stable, and pure, and true, and unalloyed has to do with the things which are eternal, and unchangeable, and unmixed; or if not, at any rate, what is most akin to them has, and that all other things are to be placed in a second or inferior class. Pro. Very true. Soc. And of the names expressing cognition, ought not the fairest to be given to the fairest things? Pro. That is natural. Soc. And are not mind and wisdom the names which are to be honored most? Pro. Yes. Soc. And these names may be said to have their truest and most exact application when the mind is engaged in the contemplation of true being? Pro. Certainly. Soc. And these were the names which I adduced of the rivals of pleasure? Pro. Very true, Socrates. Soc. In the next place, as to the mixture, here are the ingredients: pleasure and wisdom, and we may be compared to artists who have their materials ready to their hands. Pro. Yes. Soc. And now we must begin to mix them? Pro. By all means. Soc. But had we not better have a preliminary word, and refresh our memories? Pro. Of what? Soc. Of that which I have already mentioned. Well, says the proverb, that we ought to repeat twice, and even thrice, that which is good. Pro. Certainly. Soc. Well then, by Zeus, let us proceed, and I will make what I believe to be a fair summary of the argument. Pro. Let me hear. Soc. Philebus says that pleasure is the true end of all living beings, at which all ought to aim, and moreover that it is the chief good of all, and that the two names, good and pleasant, are correctly given to one thing and one nature. Socrates, on the other hand, begins by denying this, and further says that in nature as in name they are two, and that wisdom partakes more than pleasure of the good. Is not and was not this what we were saying, Protarchus? Pro. Certainly. Soc. And is there not, and was there not, a further point which was conceded between us? Pro. What was it? Soc. That the good differs from all other things. Pro. In what respect? Soc. In that the being who possesses good, always, everywhere, and in all things, has the most perfect sufficiency, and is never in need of anything else. Pro. Exactly. Soc. And did we not endeavor to make an imaginary separation of wisdom and pleasure, assigning to each a distinct life, so that pleasure was wholly excluded from wisdom, and wisdom in like manner had no part whatever in pleasure? Pro. We did. Socrates. And did we think that either of them alone would be sufficient? Protarchus. Certainly not. Socrates. And if we erred in any point, then let any one who will take up the enquiry again and set us right. And assuming memory and wisdom and knowledge and true opinion to belong to the same class, let him consider whether he would desire to possess or acquire, I will not say pleasure, however abundant or intense, if he has no real perception that he is pleased, nor any consciousness of what he feels, nor any recollection, however momentary, of the feeling. But would he desire to have anything at all if these faculties were wanting to him? And about wisdom I ask the same question. Can you conceive that any one would choose to have all wisdom absolutely devoid of pleasure, rather than with a certain degree of pleasure, or all pleasure devoid of wisdom, rather than with a certain degree of wisdom? Protarchus. Certainly not, Socrates. But why repeat such questions any more? Socrates. Then the perfect and universally eligible and entirely good cannot possibly be either of them? Protarchus. Impossible. Socrates. Then now we must ascertain the nature of the good more or less accurately, in order, as we were saying, that the second place may be duly assigned? Protarchus. Right. Socrates. Have we not found a road which leads towards the good? Protarchus. What road? Socrates. Supposing that a man had to be found, and you could discover in what house he lived, would not that be a great step towards the discovery of the man himself? Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And now reason intimates to us, as at our first beginning, that we should seek the good, not in the unmixed life, but in the mixed. Protarchus. True. Socrates. There is greater hope of finding that which we are seeking in the life which is well mixed, than in that which is not? Protarchus. Far greater. Socrates. Then now let us mingle, Protarchus, at the same time offering up a prayer to Dionysus, or Hephaestus, or whoever is the god who presides over the ceremony of mingling. Protarchus. By all means. Socrates. Are not we the cupbearers? And here are two fountains which are flowing at our side. One, which is pleasure, may be likened to a fountain of honey; the other, wisdom, a sober draught, in which no wine mingles, is of water, unpleasant but healthful. Out of these we must seek to make the fairest of all possible mixtures. Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. Tell me first, should we be most likely to succeed if we mingled every sort of pleasure with every sort of wisdom? Protarchus. Perhaps we might. Socrates. But I should be afraid of the risk, and I think that I can show a safer plan. Protarchus. What is it? Socrates. One pleasure was supposed by us to be truer than another, and one art to be more exact than another. Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. There was also supposed to be a difference in sciences, some of them regarding only the transient and perishing, and others the permanent and imperishable, and everlasting and immutable; and when judged by the standard of truth, the latter, as we thought, were truer than the former. Protarchus. Very good and right. Socrates. If then we were to begin by mingling the sections of each class which have the most of truth, will not the union suffice to give us the loveliest of lives? Or shall we still want some elements of another kind? Protarchus. I think that we ought to do what you suggest. Socrates. Let us suppose a man who understands justice, and has reason as well as understanding about the true nature of this and of all other things. Protarchus. We will suppose such a man. Socrates. Will he have enough of knowledge if he is acquainted only with the divine circle and sphere, and knows nothing of our human spheres and circles, but uses only divine circles and measures in the building of a house? Protarchus. The knowledge which is only superhuman, Socrates, is ridiculous in man. Socrates. What do you mean? Do you mean that you are to throw into the cup and mingle the impure and uncertain art which uses the false measure and the false circle? Protarchus. Yes, we must, if any of us is ever to find his way home. Socrates. And am I to include music, which, as I was saying just now, is full of guesswork and imitation, and is wanting in purity? Protarchus. Yes, I think that you must, if human life is to be a life at all. Socrates. Well then, suppose that I give way, And like a doorkeeper who is pushed and overborne by the mob, I open the door wide, and let knowledge of every sort stream in, and the pure mingle with the impure. Pro. I do not know, Socrates, that any great harm would come of having them all, if only you have the first sort. Soc. Well then, shall I let them all flow into what Homer poetically terms a meeting of the waters? Pro. By all means. Soc. There, I have let them in, and now I must return to the fountain of pleasure, for we were not permitted to begin by mingling in a single stream the true portions of both according to our original intention, but the love of all knowledge constrained us to let all the sciences flow in together before the pleasures. Pro. Quite true. Soc. And now the time has come for us to consider about the pleasures also, whether we shall in like manner let them go all at once, or at first only the true ones. Pro. It will be by far the safer course to let flow the true ones first. Soc. Let them flow then. And now, if there are any necessary pleasures, as there were arts and sciences necessary, must we not mingle them? Pro. Yes, the necessary pleasures should certainly be allowed to mingle. Soc. The knowledge of the arts has been admitted to be innocent and useful always. And if we say of pleasures in like manner that all of them are good and innocent for all of us at all times, we must let them all mingle? Pro. What shall we say about them, and what course shall we take? Soc. Do not ask me, Protarchus, but ask the daughters of pleasure and wisdom to answer for themselves. Pro. How? Soc. Tell us, O beloved, shall we call you pleasures or by some other name? Would you rather live with or without wisdom? I am of opinion that they would certainly answer as follows. Pro. How? Soc. They would answer, as we said before, that for any single class to be left by itself, pure and isolated, is not good, nor altogether possible, and that if we are to make comparisons of one class with another and choose, there is no better companion than knowledge of things in general, and likewise the perfect knowledge, if that may be, of ourselves in every respect. Pro. And our answer will be, in that ye have spoken well. Soc. Very true. And now let us go back and interrogate wisdom and mind. Would you like to have any pleasures in the mixture? And they will reply, What pleasures do you mean? Pro. Likely enough. Soc. And we shall take up our parable and say, do you wish to have the greatest and most vehement pleasures for your companions, in addition to the true ones? Why, Socrates, they will say, how can we, seeing that they are the source of 10,000 hindrances to us? They trouble the souls of men, which are our habitation, with their madness. They prevent us from coming to the birth, and are commonly the ruin of the children which are born to us, causing them to be forgotten and unheeded. But the true and pure pleasures of which you spoke, know to be of our family, and also those pleasures which accompany health and temperance, and which every virtue, like a goddess, has in her train to follow her about wherever she goes. Mingle these and not the others. There would be great want of sense in any one who desires to see a fair and perfect mixture, and to find in it what is the highest good in man and in the universe, and to divine what is the true form of good. There would be great want of sense in his allowing the pleasures, which are always in the company of folly and vice, to mingle with mind in the cup. Is not this a very rational and suitable reply, which mind has made, both on her own behalf, as well as on the behalf of memory and true opinion? Pro. Most certainly. Soc. And still there must be something more added, which is a necessary ingredient in every mixture. Pro. What is that? Soc. Unless truth enter into the composition, nothing can truly be created or subsist. Pro. Impossible. Soc. Quite impossible. And now you and Philebus must tell me whether anything is still wanting in the mixture, for to my way of thinking the argument is now completed, and may be compared to an incorporeal law, which is going to hold fair rule over a living body. Pro. I agree with you, Socrates. Soc. And may we not say with reason that we are now at the vestibule of the habitation of the good? Pro. I think that we are. Soc. What, then, is there in the mixture which is most precious, and which is the principal cause why such a state is universally beloved by all? When we have discovered it, we will proceed to ask whether this omnipresent nature is more akin to pleasure or to mind. Pro. Quite right. In that way we shall be better able to judge. Soc. And there is no difficulty in seeing the cause which renders any mixture either of the highest value or of none at all. Pro. What do you mean? Soc. Every man knows it. Pro. What? Soc. He knows that any want of measure and symmetry in any mixture whatever must always of necessity be fatal both to the elements and to the mixture, which is then not a mixture, but only a confused medley, which brings confusion on the possessor of it. Pro. Most true. Soc. And now the power of the good has retired into the region of the beautiful, for measure and symmetry are beauty and virtue all over the world. Pro. True. Soc. Also we said that truth was to form an element in the mixture. Pro. Certainly. Soc. Then if we are not able to hunt the good with one idea only, with three we may catch our prey. Beauty, symmetry, truth are the three, and these taken together we may regard as the single cause of the mixture, and the mixture as being good by reason of the infusion of them. Pro. Quite right. Soc. And now, Protarchus, any man could decide well enough whether pleasure or wisdom is more akin to the highest good, and more honourable among gods and men. Pro. Clearly, and yet perhaps the argument had better be pursued to the end. Soc. We must take each of them separately in their relation to pleasure and mind, and pronounce upon them, for we ought to see to which of the two they are severally most akin. Pro. You are speaking of beauty, truth, and measure? Soc. Yes, Protarchus. Take truth first, and after passing in review mind, truth, pleasure, pause a while, and make answer to yourself as to whether pleasure or mind is more akin to truth. Pro. There is no need to pause, for the difference between them is palpable. Pleasure is the veriest impostor in the world, and it is said that in the pleasures of love, which appear to be the greatest, perjury is excused by the gods. For pleasures, like children, have not the least particle of reason in them, whereas mind is either the same as truth, or the most like truth, and the truest. Soc. Shall we next consider measure in like manner, and ask whether pleasure has more of this than wisdom, or wisdom than pleasure? Pro. Here is another question which may be easily answered, for I imagine that nothing can ever be more immoderate than the transports of pleasure, or more in conformity with measure than mind and knowledge. Soc. Very good, but there still remains the third test. Has mind a greater share of beauty than pleasure, and is mind or pleasure the fairer of the two? Pro. No one, Socrates, either awake or dreaming, ever saw or imagined mind or wisdom to be in aught unseemly, at any time, past, present, or future. Soc. Right. Pro. But when we see some one indulging in pleasures, perhaps in the greatest of pleasures, the ridiculous or disgraceful nature of the action makes us ashamed, and so we put them out of sight, and consign them to darkness, under the idea that they ought not to meet the eye of day. Soc. Then, Protarchus, you will proclaim everywhere, by word of mouth to this company, and by messengers bearing the tidings far and wide, that pleasure is not the first of possessions, nor yet the second, but that in measure, and the mean, and the suitable, and the like, the eternal nature has been found. Pro. Yes, that seems to be the result of what has been now said. Soc. In the second class is contained the symmetrical, and beautiful, and perfect or sufficient, and all which are of that family? Pro. True. Soc. And if you reckon in the third class mind and wisdom, you will not be far wrong, if I divine aright. Pro. I dare say. Soc. And would you not put in the fourth class the goods, which we were affirming to appertain specially to the soul? Sciences, and arts, and true opinions, as we called them. These come after the third class, and form the fourth, as they are certainly more akin to good than pleasure is. Protarchus. Surely. Socrates. The fifth class are the pleasures which were defined by us as painless, being the pure pleasures of the soul herself, as we termed them, which accompany some the sciences, and some the senses. Protarchus. Perhaps. Socrates. And now, as Orpheus says, with the sixth generation cease the glory of my song. Here at the sixth award let us make an end. All that remains is to set the crown on our discourse. Protarchus. True. Socrates. Then let us sum up and reassert what has been said, thus offering the third libation to the Saviour Zeus. Protarchus. How? Socrates. Philebus affirmed that pleasure was always and absolutely the good. Protarchus. I understand. This third libation, Socrates, of which you spoke, meant a recapitulation. Socrates. Yes, but listen to the sequel. Convinced of what I have just been saying, and feeling indignant at the doctrine, which is maintained not by Philebus only, but by thousands of others, I affirmed that mind was far better and far more excellent as an element of human life than pleasure. Protarchus. True. Socrates. But suspecting that there were other things which were also better, I went on to say that if there was anything better than either, then I would claim the second place for mind over pleasure, and pleasure would lose the second place as well as the first. Protarchus. You did. Socrates. Nothing could be more satisfactorily shown than the unsatisfactory nature of both of them. Protarchus. Very true. Socrates. The claims both of pleasure and mind to be the absolute good have been entirely disproven in this argument, because they are both wanting in self-sufficiency, and also in adequacy and perfection. Protarchus. Most true. Socrates. But though they must both resign in favor of another, mind is 10,000 times nearer and more akin to the nature of the conqueror than pleasure. Protarchus. Certainly. Socrates. And according to the judgment which has now been given, pleasure will rank fifth. Protarchus. True. Socrates. But not first, no, not even if all the oxen and horses and animals in the world by their pursuit of enjoyment proclaim her to be so, although the many, trusting in them, as diviners trust in birds, determine that pleasures make up the good of life, and deem the lusts of animals to be better witnesses than the inspirations of divine philosophy. Protarchus. And now, Socrates, we tell you that the truth of what you have been saying is approved by the judgment of all of us. Socrates. And will you let me go? Protarchus. There is a little which yet remains, and I will remind you of it, for I am sure that you will not be the first to go away from an argument. End of Philebus by Plato. Translated by Benjamin Jowett. Read by Geoffrey Edwards. Meta-coordinated by Ice Queen. Proof listened by Sam R. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.